on Twitter at John A. Matthews 2. At the briefing, we are discussing our future on the ballot. Los Angeles County official ballots have been mailed, and there is a huge race for Board of Supervisors, District 2, happening right now. Senator Holly Mitchell, one of District 2 candidates, joins us today. She has served in the California State Senate since 2013 and is the first African American to chair the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. Her opponent in the runoff is Councilman Herb Wesson, a former State Assembly Speaker who served as president of the Los Angeles City Council. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors is the largest local government board in the country, responsible for more than 10 million residents. The roughly $30 billion annual budget covers services like foster care, jails, and the Sheriff's Department, making it a focal point of efforts to reduce police violence. Earlier this summer, in response to the uprisings calling for defunding the police, the LA County Board of Supervisors voted to put a measure on the November ballot, which would cut more than $145 million from the county sheriff's budget and shift those resources to community. We will talk about law enforcement accountability and reimagining Los Angeles. But before that, Senator Mitchell, I'd love to hear about your journey. Before entering politics, you were executive director of Crystal Stairs, advocating for children and families. What made you decide to leave this role and get involved in politics full time?
Thank you very much, John, for the opportunity. And, I think the reality is I never left that role. As a first assembly member elected in 2010 and then to the Senate, I've continued to be an advocate for working families, children, and vulnerable communities. But literally, I was sitting in a budget subcommittee hearing in 2008 with a hearing room filled with families, largely from the second supervisorial district. And we'd come to Sacramento to voice our deep concern and, quite personally, my fear about a proposal the legislature was considering that they ultimately acted upon, which was to cut $1 billion out of the child care budget for the state of California. And I got to tell you, I literally sat there in that hearing room and got mad. I realized that LA County is home to 1/3 of the state's children. At that time, there was not an LA County legislator on that subcommittee making that really, really life-altering decisions for the working families that I served as CEO of Crystal Stairs. And I got mad enough to decide to run for office. I understood that the legislature was in a tough bind. We were in the middle of the Great Recession, but I was concerned about some of the budget actions they were taking were going to have long-term impact on vulnerable communities that could have possibly been avoided with a little more nuance in their budget management or even in cutting. So that's how I went from CEO, Crystal Stairs, family advocate, to family advocate legislator.
So in your role as family advocate legislator, what's a story that really sticks out to you in this moment when you're advocating?
There's so many. I think the stories that stick with me always that I will never forget are the stories during those first couple of years when I was in the assembly, when we were still cutting deeply into life-sustaining services that people need to survive. I remember recipients of in-home supportive care services, people with severe disabilities, where we were cutting the hours of their care and having a woman ask me, what 8 hours out of the day that I think she should cut, in that she needed to be ventilated, needed help getting up out of bed every day. Should she wait in the morning and delay her breakfast for her care provider not to show up till noon? Or perhaps she should take the risk overnight and not having anyone there to respond if her alarm system rang, suggesting that she needed ventilation. I remember a little boy from San Diego. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, who talked to us about he felt it was unfair that his mother had to sleep on the floor in their home and give he and his siblings the bed because she couldn't afford beds and mattresses for everybody. And that it was unfair that she worked 2 and 3 jobs and still didn't earn enough to pay the rent monthly. I remember the unhoused mother of 3 who was answering the question one of my Republican colleagues posed to her about why she chose to live on the river. And she educated us about the challenges of being a homeless family. And if you have sons who reach their early teenage years, they can no longer stay in the family wing. They have to move over to the single adult wing of the shelters, and how she didn't feel comfortable sending her 13-year-old son to that wing. Those are stories that will stick with me forever. And they're stories that remain true today and continue to resonate, particularly for many of the residents in the second district, especially now suffering disproportionately as a result of the economic pandemic, also known as COVID-19.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's heartbreaking, and there's so many more stories in this moment, as you said, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot of policies out there. There's a lot of propositions in California. Voters are overwhelmed. How are you distinguishing yourself from your opponent?
Oh, I think it's a very clear distinction, from my perspective, because just like you said, we are at a pivotal moment in our history. And as a result, I think people are going to look for contrast versus consensus. And I hope, because I too, as a voter, am looking for bold, transformative leadership. And as it relates to the county, as in your introduction, you talked about the work of the county. The current board has made some really amazing policy shifts in the last month, several months, almost a year. And the reality is they're moving more towards providing help and hope to people in crisis, as opposed to prosecution and incarceration. And so as a result, I think we all need to look to someone, a candidate that I believe I am the one, who has policymaking, practical life experience in those program areas. Someone who understands the welfare system, the foster care system, someone who has spent 10 years now that I've served in the legislature, before it kind of became the trend to really have meaningful conversations about criminal and juvenile justice reform, how we right-size those systems, and how we hold law enforcement accountable. Going back to my legislation of almost 10 years ago, I carried the bill to create parity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine. I carried an entire package of legislation, equity and justice, that began to eliminate sentence enhancements, making sure that we're no longer trying 15 and 16-year-olds as adults, and was proud to co-author the bill last year, AB 392, around police conduct in terms of their use of lethal force. I think that's the skill set that we should be looking for this particular role. The Board of Supervisors, as you said, is critical in terms of their power and the reach of their policymaking. They've got administrative responsibilities and quasi-judicial. So it's a unique elected body that we have to make sure we're electing the right person. Elections can't be popularity contests. We need to ask the tough questions about who has the skill set and can show us a history of policymaking that fits this current role.
So you've spoken about that skill set and some of the areas you've worked on. So criminal justice reform, law enforcement accountability, housing. I know you've done work in housing. There's a huge platform there, and I wonder if many guests are also wondering why go from the California State Senate to the a county position. I think that people are trying to figure out why that makes sense.
So first of all, let me be clear: it is not about personal gain at all, or it's just not about that. It's about the work of the county is a reflection of the kind of work I've done my entire career and the kind of work I've trained for, having run the largest child care family services agency in the country, having served in the legislature for 10 years and served as budget chair for 4. Those are the skill sets and experiences that prepare me for the kind of work done at the county level. LA County is 10 million residents. 2 million people live in the second district. A district that has amazing assets and resources and rich, beautiful history. A district that also suffers disproportionately from many, if not all, the challenges LA County is experiencing. Everywhere from food insecurity to housing insecurity to limited access to mental health and healthcare services, and just affordability, looking at how incomes have not kept pace with inflation, nor the cost of housing. And so coming home to the county is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of providing direct services to vulnerable populations. That's the work I've done my entire career. And I would be honored to have the opportunity to come to my home county. 3 generations of my family have called LA County home. So this is an opportunity for me to bring the skill set I acquired in Sacramento home to continue with problem solving and my commitment to the residents who live there.
For our viewers out there who know they're in LA County, but actually aren't sure if they're in District 2, can you name like a few of the cities that encompass District 2? Not all of them, but like,
Right.
some of the borders.
It's interesting, the second district is the smallest in terms of geographic footprint, but the most densely populated. So there's 9 cities, from Culver City to the city of LA, Inglewood, Compton, Carson, Watts, Willowbrook, some of the unincorporated areas that also would be familiar to people. West Athens, Leimert Park, Ladera, downtown LA, as far west as Cheviot Hills, all those communities, Pico, Fairfax.
Perfect. So I'd like to shift a little bit. Senator Mitchell, you support Measure J, better known as Reimagine LA. This would reinvest hundreds of millions of dollars directly into community investment programs. How are you reimagining LA in this moment? And does this measure go far enough for you?
So I'm thrilled that to be able to bear witness and be a partner to a community stakeholder process that is really setting an example nationwide about how people who have been touched by the system, their family members, have found their voice, have organized, have become directly involved in advocacy in the policymaking process. And that's where Measure J has come from. Does it go far enough? I am concerned that people will perceive that 10% set aside as the ceiling. And I don't think that's the case. Minimally, it should be perceived as the floor, because it's got to send a signal and empower the Board of Supervisors that what we all want, what research has shown us works, is investment on the front end. I've come to this realization that the criminal justice system has become this artificial backstop, if you will, for other failed systems. When our mental health system has failed people, alcohol and drug treatment has failed system, our public education system has failed people. It's the jail system that catches us, and that's not what it's designed for. And so investments on the front end, making sure that people have other options than to call the police if a family member is having a mental health crisis, if a foster parent is struggling with the placement of their foster kid, you should have someone else to call to help facilitate that than the police. Law enforcement didn't sign up for, nor are they trained to be mental health professionals, homeless placement workers, any of those things. We've got to stand up those other important government programs and fund them appropriately, so we're truly meeting the needs of our residents, meeting the needs of the individual resident, as well as giving all of us an option other than to call the police for social problems, quite frankly.
So you've spoken about your relationship to community and the impact that community organizations have had in introducing Measure J and reimagining Los Angeles. Can you talk a little bit more about your relationship to community groups and specifically how it impacts your legislating and your ideas for reform in LA? And to back up, you recently had a District 2 forum with Justice LA. I know you've been in touch with other groups. Can you just talk a little bit more about how that impacts your process?
Well, I think the fact that I was in a budget hearing room with a hearing room full of advocates on behalf of working families and their children is indicative of really how I've spent my entire 10 years in the legislature, really working with community to influence policy. That's just my orientation. And so my entire legislative package, primarily around criminal and juvenile justice right sizing, has really stemmed from research and community stakeholders, people who have been system touched, as well as all the amazing academic research and advocacy groups that have been born in more recent years to advocate for this right sizing process. So, there's so many, from ACLU to ARC to Youth Justice Coalition. There are many across the state that we've worked and collaborated with over the years now on any number of pieces of legislation.
So I'd like to focus on juvenile justice. You just mentioned your work around juvenile justice. What in California has changed with respect to juvenile justice, and what are you committed to doing at the county level?
We've had major reforms, and I'd say the past 5 years, really rethinking and a move to stop the criminalization of children, because that's where we had come to. The fact that I had to introduce a bill to set a minimum age for incarceration because California didn't have one. So when we did the analysis, there were counties that had 7-year-olds in juvenile hall for violent crimes like curfew violation. Are you kidding me? That case stopped me in my tracks and made me think, how did we get to a place as a civilized society where someone saw a 7-year-old by themselves on the street after 11 o'clock at night, and the first thing they thought to do was call the police, as opposed to a social worker or someone to see if the child was in danger. But that's what I mean by we had begun to criminalize children and childish behavior. California was in the early cutting edge of the whole 0 to 5 brain development. And so to take that, through beyond early care and education into looking at the juvenile justice system with that lens, we had to understand that many of the kids in the system were victims of trauma themselves. And quite frankly, I came to really understand that whether you ended up in child protective services and foster care or juvenile hall, often just depended upon who showed up first, a social worker or law enforcement, because it was the same kids. And so I'm so proud to have been a part of the effort here at the state level through the budget process that I chair to make this huge policy decision to transition Department of Juvenile Justice and the 800 young people that are currently housed in DJJ facilities out of the criminal justice arm into Health and Human Services, an action that the county had talked about for many years. And so it really gives us an opportunity to use the ACEs measure in terms of trauma exposure that our Surgeon General here in California has identified, and really meet children where they are. That's always been my orientation in the work I've done. My juvenile justice right sizing legislation, again, set a minimum age. If you're under 13, you don't go to jail. We stopped allowing children to waive their Miranda rights. We eliminated the fines and fees for juveniles. Again, we stopped trying 15 and 16-year-olds as adults. And so those were very important first steps to really kind of reel back in these excessive policies that have had nothing to do with improving public safety and everything to do with ruining lives.
Yeah, that's terrifying. And I always think about, when I was 6 or 7, that, I could have been that kid depending on, like you said, any number of circumstances, including who's in the neighborhood, who my parents are, and who's called first. I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about affordable housing. As you know, in the county, this is a huge problem. Last year, the LA County Board of Supervisors passed 2 measures to protect tenants, limiting rent increases in a 1-year period and providing just cause eviction protections for most residential rental units in the unincorporated areas of LA County. Do you plan to continue to expand rent control in LA County?
I think we have to. I was proud to vote on the legislation at the state level that expanded rent control and rent control protections in areas of the state that didn't have it. The city of LA has done the same, and I think the county was very appropriate, particularly now, given what the economic pandemic COVID has led us to be in, brings to bear for renters. And so I think it's very important. It's also important, particularly in the 2nd Supervisorial District and the district I currently represent in the Senate, to understand the challenges of mom and pop and low to moderate income property owners who are also suffering through this economic pandemic. And so we've got to figure out as government how to protect renters, but also not allow mom and pop property owners to lose their property to developers and other outside interests. So it's going to be a very delicate balancing act, but we have to figure out how to do both to protect really kind of the integrity and fabric and the balance of the renter market, as well as the mom and pop homeowners and property owners, which are the vast majority in the 2nd Supervisorial District.
In engaging in that balancing act, how are you distinguishing yourself from your opponent when it comes to affordable housing and making sure we're addressing both houselessness and, like you said, making sure people can keep their homes?
Well, again, this is a space I've been involved in for years. I was very proud to carry a measure last year with regard to the elimination of discrimination based on source of income. People who have veterans who have federal vouchers or people who have Section 8 vouchers in LA County were having to turn them back in because they couldn't find a landlord who would accept them. You've seen the advertisements, 2-bedroom, 1-bath, no Section 8. So I carried the bill, very controversial bill, that acknowledged that that's a wonderful source of income for property owners. It's constant, it's the federal government, and no bias should be levied upon those who qualify for those vouchers. I think it's really important that we acknowledge, under the leadership of my opponent over the past 10 years, 93% of the new construction in LA City has been at market rate. And what we recognize is LA County is 500,000 housing units short, and we've got to build, and we've got to build for those for across the spectrum, but we have to pay close attention to affordable housing and even how we define affordability. So we're going to have to talk about what that looks like. Does that mean more dense construction? Does that mean more construction along transit corridors? Does that mean ADUs, which I've supported in the legislature? That must mean being more creative in terms of what we're building and how we're building it, to bring down that estimated $500,000 per unit cost that the city controller has made public. We've got to be creative in terms of how we address this issue.
So Holly, I know you're very busy. It's election season, ballots are out. But before you go, people are overwhelmed right now with everything, with life, with campaigns. What's giving you hope today that you want to leave with our viewers?
That is a great question. I mentioned being a third-generation Native Angelino. And, LA County was very good to my great-grandmother and grandmother and parents. My parents met as eligibility workers working for LA County Department of Public Social Services. So from a very young child, I understood, because since all the adults in my life worked for government, I understood the role of government was to help people who needed it. And people who worked in government, that was your job. And if people didn't understand or didn't think government doesn't really impact my life, what's the county? We all had a deeper and better understanding mid-March when we all woke up and were told by either the mayor of your city or the governor, schools are closed, your houses of worship are closed, many of our businesses have been closed, hospitality, the entertainment industry, some of the major employers in LA County. We all understood the role government could play in our everyday lives. And it's for times such as this that government must stand up and provide cover and protection for our residents. Government has to stand up to make sure that every essential worker has protective equipment, that we're providing childcare services to essential workers. Government must stand up to make sure that the standards we put in place allow children to return to school safely. Government must stand up to really figure out how we bridge this current economy and keep people from falling into homelessness and isolation. And so making sure that the Employment Development Department is being responsive. This is the role of government, and it's times like this that government has the opportunity to get it right and do better. Many in the second supervisorial district who have suffered disproportionately as a result of COVID-19 were also in tenuous places before COVID-19. And so when people say to me, I want to go back to normal, I don't. I want us to be better. I want us to use this snapshot in time where the entire world understands how some communities have fared better than others to make a commitment around equity for the people who live in the second district. So I want to come out of this with more secure housing, fewer food deserts, a recommitment to building and expanding access to healthcare services and mental health services, to reimagine, if you will, the relationship between public safety and community and what we must fund to provide the true supports every member of the community needs to be successful and thrive, and to meet unique needs if you have alcohol or drug addiction, or if you're suffering from mental illness. So what excites me and gives me hope is recognizing the role government can and must play to meet the needs of a community, a country in crisis. That's why for me, this election up and down the ballot is so important, and why I am eager to take my lifetime of professional experiences and the lens I wear as a policymaker, as a family advocate policymaker to the county, to help drive this train to support families in the coming months and years. That's what gives me hope, the role government can play to improve our lives.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining us on the briefing and talking about our future on the ballot. This episode will be available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen to podcasts. We're live again tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern with Nithya Raman running for LA City Council. Follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for the latest news. And again, thank you so much, Senator. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for the opportunity, everybody.